Hello and welcome. My name is Bianca Martinez, as well as your host this evening.
And welcome to Eres Tea Talks, where we spill the tea on taboo topics affecting our community.
And I think that a collective is essential. Like everything I do is on the backs of my ancestors and of my people.
We deserve to heal by any means necessary, and if that means mixing both like Western and your ancestral practices, then you gotta do that.
Today we are honored with the presence of Dr. Zuleika Clark, sex therapist, and Veronica Picard, who is a pathfinder, connector, and writer. Hi and welcome. Thank you so much for being with me today and having this super important conversation about our community. Okay, so first, let's start off with defining intergenerational trauma through the lens of trauma. So what is trauma?
Trauma to me is anything that invokes a cortisol spike. So that can be flight or it can be fight. And the ways in which that shows up in our body, when those levels get raised, then we react or we don't react. So even for me, trauma can mean those levels get raised and then we don't do anything about it. So then it gets stuck in the body.
I think of emotional, social, spiritual, economic, sexual violations or things that evoke distress for an individual community. It can be something that you witness or you're a part of, or even through compassion, having a connection with communities, you can still be affected by something.
Okay. And so in coming off of that lens and that understanding, how would we look at intergenerational trauma?
Intergenerational trauma is when everything that we named happens across time. So something that happened to a grandmother gets passed down to the child, gets passed down to the child's child, until somebody looks around and says, is this my trauma to bear? Or what are the ways in which I can learn from this experience? So the intergenerational piece implies and names that it gets carried. So the same way that legacies of survival get carried, they also have the chance to have legacies of trauma come with it. And that often, depending on the person, the place of trauma can also be the place of resilience too.
Intergenerational trauma is deep. And what happens is if something needs healing and requires healing and is not able to get addressed in a lifetime, then it can be transmitted throughout generations, up to 7 generations, possibly longer. And it is passed not even consciously. These are in ways that we may not even be aware of, but it continues to show up, and the lessons that we need to learn, whether it's from our family or our ancestors, will continue to show up until we address them.
Mm-hmm. Would you guys say this is the same as historical trauma? And if not, what would be the difference?
Historical trauma implies some kind of, well, before I answer that, I want to frame it with the African proverb that says, as long as the hunter tells the story, the lion will be the villain. So especially when we talk about historical trauma, so some of the historical traumas that we're used to hearing about are, especially if we're taking the history part literal, we'll learn about the Holocaust in Europe, but we won't learn about the Holocaust that happened throughout the continent of Africa when borders were being drawn and people were being displaced. So when we think about historical trauma, we can think about it in the same way that we understand trauma on a more intimate level, but historical trauma implies to me that it's something that's more so of a shared experience. So for people of the African diaspora, we have a historical trauma of how we ended up on this side of the world anyway, right? Because if you reset the board, we're not really supposed to be here. We're supposed to be on the other side. So that historical trauma names that even if we were to go back over there, it would be similar to what happened in Black Panther, the movie. We would be more so about, like in frame of Eric Killmonger than we would be T'Challa, no matter how much healing we did, because of the ways in which things that are beyond us through space and time played into why we are not connected to our roots, right? So historical trauma to me means understanding the ways in which I'm reacting to things that have happened before my time, way before my time, as it is a shared experience with other people of similar backgrounds.
Okay. There's different types of trauma, but a lot of the types of trauma happen to be left out of the DSM and other official books that cater to people of European descent. And so when I think of historical trauma, yes, that's definitely something that affects many people in different ways, kind of like what you were saying. And it is more so, I think of it as a collective. But I also think about historical trauma. I think that's a perfect proverb to bring up, because what about the lion, but what about the gazelle? What about the grass? You know, there's lots of different perspectives that get written out of history or her story. You know, like there's voices that have never, that should be spoken, but we don't even know to speak them because they've got lost. And so there's a lot of healing that needs to be done, and there's a little overlap between, the historical trauma that occurs. If that's not addressed, then that can be passed down throughout the generations. So with that, there's an overlap, but there also different people had different experiences within the history and the her story and the trans story, and there's lots of things that were lost that we don't know, but that still can show up and manifest in itself in different ways, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yeah, most definitely.
You don't even have to know your real history to be affected by it. And then also there's really knowing and learning about how we've been lied to, or it's being projected as our history when in fact it's not our history. That even where people start prehistoric, like where do you even start? There's so much. And then the way history is written, it's so colonial, it's so white, it's so male centered, and that can play a role in how we understand ourselves, because history can inform how we understand ourselves and our culture and our ways of being. And so it's definitely something to consider.
And so we're talking a lot about how trauma, intergenerational trauma manifests itself. What are ways or physical and internal consequences in how intergenerational trauma may manifest itself?
How it can show up and how it can manifest in our relationships, in the way we connect to people, in the way we understand differences, in our conflict resolution, in our fears, in what we avoid, in what we hate. I think about phobias and what we fear, that it may not have a logic in a present day, but its logic is not based off of current understanding. So it could be from a deeper ancestral wound.
Yeah, it's like so complex and so layered, and I think people, especially in this time, people are so quick to medicate, and doctors are so quick to medicate. It's such a young age. And as I continue to learn and understand intergenerational trauma through like my own mental health experiences, just kind of being like, well, at the age of 3, why did I have so much anxiety? That doesn't make sense. You're a child, you're supposed to kind of be living life, and then seeing how, oh wow, it can manifest itself so early in so many different ways. Whether it's social anxiety, whether it's, like you've said, connecting with people, having relationships, and how then that kind of has like a snowball effect as we get older, when we can't pinpoint exactly what it is or have the names for it until later on.
There's a lot of different ways of relating, and it's not just one script. And I wish we had more tolerance and acceptance for different ways of being and loving each other, as opposed to, oh, if you were born in this body, you can only love people born in that body. When some people are attracted to intellectually connected, some people can see spirits and relate to someone's spirit that may not be the same as someone's physical manifestation. And again, when you remember that gender is a colonial imposition, like how we understand what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman has already been distorted, that there was a lot of more gender fluidity in pre-colonial context, in indigenous ways of knowing, but we don't have access to that. I think the thing is that there's sexual trauma that has happened, and we have to address that in our own way of understanding ourself, whether that's our sexual spiritual, our sexual physical, our sexual emotional, our sexual ways of being. It's not just one way of being. And to restrict ourselves to knowing ourselves as sexual beings can be limiting. I don't know. Like, it's not. Who are you living your life to please? Who are you? At the expense of what? Your self-expression, you're at being able to experience love in a full way. We have the right to pleasure. We have a right to information. We have the right to know ourselves as we understand ourselves.
As we're talking about this, and we're also talking about intergenerational trauma, and we're talking about trauma, I also really agree with you in the sense of, like, at some point we have to do the work, because we can get stuck in this infinity loop of like, well, this happened, and because this happened, then I can only respond this way, or I can't respond at all, and I can only be in bed. And it's like, okay, at what point, especially if we're talking about storytelling and reclaiming those kind of narratives, how long are we going to keep telling ourselves that we are the victim? No matter how valid the external structures are, because sometimes I fear that if we get stuck in that trauma loop, then we don't see the spots where we can actually affect change.
If there's anything you feel that we missed or you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. So again, thank you. And thank you to our audience and our followers for joining us today. As always, follow us on Instagram at eres, ERES.UYOU, on Facebook at eres, ER3S.U. And definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment.